On the way to Mass today, I was thinking about my family and how family can be so right on and true, and they don't worry about what they say to you. So I gave the homily last night, and afterwards my wife said, "The microphone needs to be a little closer, we couldn't hear you." And my kids said, "Dad, this is your second homily at Our Lady of Mercy. You know what they're going to be thinking, don't you?" And I thought they were going to say something nice. And the kids said, "Well, they're going to be really watching you to see if the first one was just beginner's luck." We'll see how that goes. We just heard the words of Jesus claiming that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. For years I had difficulty understanding this passage. For his yoke is easy and his burden is light. However, after a few years, the concept became somewhat clearer. Christ has invited all of us who labor and are burdened to come to him. Whom among us doesn't carry any burden? How many of us carry sorrow in our hearts for things we have done in the past? How many of us possess some degree of hatred or anger that we just can't entirely let go? What about fear? Fear of abandonment, fear of violence, fear of responsibility. What about those those who carry the weight of repeated failure? Even St. Paul stated in his letter to the Romans, "I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate." Meaning, why do I keep doing the things in my life I know I should not do, and can't always do the things in my life I know I should do? How many of us can relate to such a quote? There are also burdens that some of us carry that are related to a death of a loved one, broken relationships, addictions, illnesses, and even problems at home and at work. Each of us are quite unique and possess our own personal burdens. I can remember one day when a man by the name of Joel came into my office at work. He sat down next to my desk. Joel's about 45 years old, and he's a large man. He's about 6'2", and he suffers with a mental illness. Joel began to tell me about his life, his sorrow, his pain, and all of his burdens. Then his eyes began to swell with tears, and then he stated in a matter-of-fact manner that there wasn't anything in his life that he was proud of. He stated that because he had a bad mind, he didn't have a wife, he didn't own a car, he didn't have any money, and he couldn't even take care of himself. He then became so overwhelmed with the words that he was speaking that he abruptly ran out of my office. About 30 minutes later, out of the blue, Joel came running back into my office, and he was smiling and full of enthusiasm. He stated, "I do have something that I'm proud of. I'm a Christian. I know Jesus, and Jesus knows me." He stated that he is saving me from sin. He's saving me from Satan, and most of all, he's saving me from myself. Joel finished the conversation by stating, "Without Jesus, I'm nothing, but with him, I'm everything." The profound realization of his relationship with Jesus changed his whole perception of his life. So what does Jesus say to us? "Come to me," he says. "Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest." Jesus is asking for us to bring our distress to him. He has no intention of leaving us alone to carry our own burdens. "Come to me," he says, and then he adds, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Okay, here's that yoke word again. For the longest time, I didn't know what a yoke was, so I had to look it up. A yoke is a plowing instrument, where two oxen are joined together. They're actually yoked together by a simple piece of wood in order to share the workload and to pull a plow behind them. There's a legend that in his carpenter's workshop, the young Jesus of Nazareth specialized in making these yokes. It was a tricky business because the wood had to be crafted just right. If the yoke was too tight, it would dig into the animals, choking them. The legend has it that the yokes Jesus made were always perfect. They were made to fit easily, making the burden seem light. Legend or not, Jesus invites us to receive the yoke that he himself has made, the very means of carrying our burdens not by ourselves, but with his help. Having someone to share the load, the responsibility, and the worry can make all the difference. Haven't you felt the comfort, the peace, and the support when sharing a burden with a close friend or a loved one? Who better could you imagine to share such a personal and intimate thing than with Jesus himself? There's another unique aspect of being yoked to Jesus. Being yoked to Jesus also means submitting to Jesus. When I attach myself to Jesus, I am not walking alone, but I am walking alongside him. And when I am yoked, I cannot walk in my own separate way. In a sense, I'm being steered and guided by Jesus himself. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart. Jesus wants us to come to him and to join our burdens to him. And when we do that, when we surrender ourselves to Christ, we begin to learn from him. We become more meek and more humble of heart. We become more like Jesus. That's the positive side of the burdens that we carry. God is able to use our sufferings and our struggles to make us more like Christ. And even more than that, when we join our burdens to Christ, when we take his yoke upon us, we actually participate in his work of redeeming the world. He allows us to participate in his sufferings, to share in the cross that he endured, and to also share in his mission of redemption. Many of you are aware of an incident that occurred in 1981 during the month of May. An attempt was made to assassinate Pope John Paul II. His recovery was slow and painful, and for many months he was forced to carry a huge and difficult burden, but one that he nonetheless shared with Christ. He was truly yoked to Christ in his suffering and throughout his recovery. Almost 2 years after the incident, Pope John Paul released one of his most personal documents, and it was called The Christian Meaning of Human Suffering. This document, he explores the idea of Christian redemptive suffering, that even our own suffering, our own burdens, can be joined to Christ and offered up for the salvation of others. He says, in the cross of Christ, not only is redemption accomplished through suffering, in other words, not only are we redeemed as persons, but also human suffering itself has been redeemed. Our suffering, our burdens, painful as they may be, are not meaningless. Christ is able to give meaning to our lives and even to our crosses when we unite them with his cross and take up his yoke. I've met so many people over the years that attest that through their burdens and trials, they have discovered a deepening of their faith, developed a closer relationship with God, and obtained a clearer vision of who they were created to be. So many of these individuals, they reported that their journey through suffering and self-evaluation was not free of discomfort, but always produced spiritual growth, development of character, and most importantly, a showering of grace that enabled virtue to grow within them. Many of us are hit with unexpected trials and burdens, and some of us break them all on our own. However, it's within these situations, when we clearly experience the lack of control and are unable to find resolution in our lives, that we clearly can see our human frailty and our limitations. Left to our own ability, we often cannot accomplish and sustain much in our lives, but united with Christ we can endure, persevere, and find a sense of peace even during the strongest of our trials. So whatever burdens we carry today and in the days ahead, we thank God that he has not left us to carry them alone. As Catholics, we are yoked to Jesus, who helps us to carry our burdens and even allows us to participate in his work of redeeming our fallen world. Being yoked to Jesus, might we find rest for ourselves, because as he tells us in today's gospel, his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Let us think about how we're currently living our lives. Are we truly yoked to Jesus? And if we're not, what is it in our lives that's keeping us separated